Hi, everyone. It's Stephanie with the Patient Story, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest today, Bruce, who has very graciously offered his time to share his story about getting diagnosed with prostate cancer and going through treatment for it. So, Bruce, welcome.
Thank you, Stephanie. Pleasure to be here.
Bruce, we were chatting a little bit, and I had asked for a sort of fun fact, and was actually really impressed by what you came up with. What is this thing? I would love for people to know something outside of cancer about Bruce as we start this interview.
I'm passionate about scuba diving, though I don't get to do it often enough. But I've been diving since I was a little kid. My older sister scuba dove and kind of drew us into that. And used to live in California as a youngster, and but became a scuba instructor in about 1983. And the first instructor class held actually overseas in Egypt. That's where I got my instructor certification. So I was
Wow.
there for a couple of years with my then girlfriend, now wife, Lisa. So I love scuba diving and under the water, and very comfortable there.
Wow. And wow, Egypt. And that's where, is that where you met your wife, Lisa? Or you?
No, we met in college in California, Cal Poly. But
Ah,
so I went over there, and yeah, we couldn't stay apart that long, so she followed a couple months later. And so she was a real adventurous one because it wasn't easy for a young lady to go into a Muslim country back then. It was very restrictive in
right.
certain areas, and so that was a real challenge.
Wow, I could probably talk to you and Lisa for a long time about your life story, your love story. And in fact, we're hoping Lisa can join us later in this interview. So hope, people stay tuned for that because as I hear it, she was an amazing caregiver. And that is such an important aspect of any person's experience going through cancer treatment. So, well, thank you for sharing that with us, Bruce. And this first section, this first video is dedicated to the first symptoms and how you finally got diagnosed. And I know you had kind of an interesting story there too. So you said you started feeling, you had some urination problems spring 2009. What was going through your head then, and how did you slowly start to figure out what was going on?
Well, it was I just noticed that it seemed that I couldn't really control the velocity of my urination, and so whether that's due to the prostate cancer or not, I don't know specifically, but it could be. But at the time, it was a bit concerning because it was new. But at the time, also, I was getting older, so I went and saw the doctor, and they looked at it and did a digital exam. And the conclusion that was given back to me was, well, it's probably is just you getting older. There is a blood test you could do or test, but it's not really necessarily reliable. It's controversial, and besides, you're too young to think about those things anyways. And I was at the time, 58, and so it just was kind of they didn't think it was an issue or could be an issue of prostate cancer, and I'd never really heard of prostate cancer, and he never really mentioned it in the discussion with the doctor. So at that point, didn't think about it much after more, just chalked it up to getting older. But it wasn't until later, in 2012, that my older brother contacted his siblings and the male siblings and said he had been diagnosed with a very aggressive prostate cancer and recommended we get tested. And so I planned to do that, but I couldn't recall what kind of cancer. And to me, that's a problem with the lack of advocacy, is because it just wasn't in our normal daily lexicon. We just don't know about it as younger men, and older men are much more versed in it because they it's more of an older disease in general. But so when I came time to make my appointment, they said, "What kind of cancer did your brother have?" And I was thinking, okay, the thing that stuck in my mind is sort of the region where it was. So it must have been colon cancer. And so I went and got my colonoscopy, which came out with flying colors. Um, but again, that was a hazard because I hadn't heard of prostate cancer, so it wasn't in my mind. And so that could have been a fatal mistake, and nearly was so. It wasn't until later in the fall, that happened in the spring, that he followed up and said, "Did you get your test?" And I said, "Yep, I took my colon test, and it was all perfect." And then he said, "Bruce, tell me that it's a prostate test you need to take, the PSA, not colon cancer.
Right.
So then I would call my doctor again and made an appointment, get tested for PSA.
Up until this point, I mean, and thankfully, you know, you had this follow up with your brother, not too, I mean, it was months later, but thankfully it wasn't like years later or anything like that.
Right.
Do you recall sort of uh, how you processed that? You know, you're like, well, I thought it was colon cancer. Prostate cancer wasn't, like you said, even in the lexicon.
Yeah, it was. I really didn't. I knew it was concerning for him, but again, I didn't know much about it and hadn't heard much about it, I didn't think it was that big of a deal necessarily in terms of risk. And then as you start reading about it, once you're diagnosed, you realize that just as many men die every year of prostate cancer as they do of women do of breast cancer.
Um,
That was really the stunning statistic that hit me.
right.
And the other thing is when you look at it, that there's two sides of a story that are equally true but give different pictures. And the way I say that is that on one hand, you hear a lot about the prostate cancer is not often fatal, and that usually it's mild, and most men don't really have a problem with it. And that's true because most of it is along what they call doubling time for the PSA. It might be 100 years for some men. That is they're never gonna die of that necessarily. But the other half of that coin is how many men have it. And when you have that many men have it, it's very ubiquitous as you get older, that the absolute numbers of deaths are very high. And so while on one hand you look at it and sort of the percentage of men that have a problem with it that are serious or small, but the sheer number of people that have it drives that number in real terms very high. And so it wasn't until I started reading about that it really struck me that this could be bad.
Right, right.
And
This could be bad. I mean, that's it finally hit you, the sort of seriousness of the situation. Your brother at the time, was he going through treatment?
he was going through, they'd scheduled him for surgery, and it had escaped his prostate and other organs, so he had a much more dramatic surgery than I did.
Okay.
But I guess for me is when I got the results from my physician on the PSA test, the first test. She called me up and said, "We're going to schedule an appointment with you for with the urologist this afternoon. We'll schedule and make the appointment." And that's not usual. Normally, I send you the email or you look it up online and go, "Okay, those are my results." So that was when I first started really thinking, okay, this might be more serious for me as opposed to just my brother.
Right, right. And before we get into exactly what happened when you saw the urologist and heard the PSA levels, um, can you describe for people who've never undergone the PSA test just what that entails?
It's a simple blood test. They draw a little bit of blood. There's no fasting. There's no extraordinary requirements. The one thing you can't do is any sexual activity. And so a lot of men will write, you can't, it's like 3 days ahead of time, you can't have sexual activity before you do your PSA test because that could skew the results. And while men will brag, say, well, that's really annoying, in reality, I don't think many men are that are having sex that much at my age that they can't withstand 3 days of waiting to
Right,
get a blood test. So,
right.
yeah, it's very simple, very easy.
Okay.
And the PSA test itself, you know, back when I first was talking to my original doctor, that there's a lot of controversy on its efficacy. And there are some studies done on the harms of the PSA test versus the actual deaths involved. And so there's some recommendations sort of to get away from doing the PSA test a few years back, and that's right about the time I was getting it. And but when you look at the details of it, yes, the harms of the PSA test were greater than not having it, but they equated the harms equally of getting an infection from a biopsy or PSA or false positive on PSA to death. And to me, they're not equal. One's a lot worse than the other.
Right.
And so for the simple blood test, and then it's an easy thing to do. The thing you have to think about for men just looking at this for the first time is also you have to have some fortitude when you get the results.
Right.
Like the PSA test might be higher, elevated, and but it's the doubling time, how rapidly it's rising. That's the issue. So you
Right.
don't want to do necessarily, listen to your doctor, but you don't want to do any dramatic treatment without taking a second PSA test later or following up with some other evidence, such as a biopsy or something, or digital exam. Because it
Right.
might be that when you take your second PSA test, that doubling time I mentioned a minute ago might be, 100 years or 25 years or 30 years. And by then you'll die with something else before
Right.
prostate cancer.
Right.
It wasn't my case, but most cases it can be a long time. So, then at that point you just do active surveillance. You wait and just see if it changes at all.
Right.
But don't panic after your first PSA test, even if it's elevated. It might be elevated, but it'll take a long time before it goes any further.
Exactly. That's a great point. I mean, getting the baseline and to understand what that rate is really important as opposed to just that initial number for your first PSA test. So I'm glad you're bringing that up. Bruce, do you remember how long it took to get the results from that blood test, from the PSA test?
I got it. I want to say the next day. Uh,
Okay.
it's fairly quick. But when I normally labs when I go to the doctor usually take a couple of days, so it was within a day. I got that.
Okay. Wonderful. So now we can go into your doctor had said, we're going to schedule you an appointment with a urologist. And to your point, the sort of special or VIP behaviors usually not that great in healthcare.
Right.
Not a great sign. Yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah. Can you
Yeah.
describe, what happened meeting the urologist?
Yeah. But my first question is, wait, if this is cancer, why am I seeing a urologist? And prostate cancer is kind of unique in that way that it's the urologist that takes the lead generally at first. Um, and so I went to see the urologist. They did a digital exam, and they said, they felt some nodules, and said, but again, like don't panic yet. Let's wait a little while. We're going to take another PSA in 3 weeks or so and see if it changes at all and how much. And so they took a second PSA test, and then at that point it had risen at least 3 points, which in PSA terms that's a lot for just a 3 week period. So it was appearing aggressive. So at that point, the doctor recommended doing a biopsy, and I got to remind myself here of my of how long after the second PSA test. Yeah, it was about 3 weeks or so.
Right, right. I do have the dates here. Before we get into the biopsy, with the digital test, what does that mean? What were they doing?
Okay, well that's where they probe with their finger, their digit, and up your backside, and feel the prostate to see if there's any lumps or forms that they can feel that aren't normal,
Right.
and
Okay.
and so that's what they're looking for. At least to my knowledge, as a non-doctor.
And I think people get nervous. That's why I asked about the digital exam. I mean, sometimes
Right.
people get a little nervous. And so, is there anything, I guess, any sort of message to other people or men about what to expect or getting through it, or just any guidance there?
Yeah, in that part, I mean, it's really just it's just something you have to do, but it's not that I don't want to say you feel violated, but it's not that big of a deal. It's very quick. I feel around, and then you're done.
Okay.
And considering the consequences of not doing it,
Right.
it's a pretty small price to pay. A little bit of discomfort. I feel
Right.
more discomfort when I try to do my taxes every year. That's that's you know
It's a good comparison. Pain is relative. No.
that's
So you had, just to clarify, I see the dates here. So you took your first PSA test October 18th. It was at 24. The digital exam was November 1st, confirmed the nodules on the prostate. So you took a second PSA test a couple days later, November 4th. That was when you saw it was 27. And so
right,
the rate had been almost a point a week at that rate.
right, right.
So, as you mentioned, it was about 3 weeks later, you finally got a biopsy performed. Can you describe for people who don't understand what happens at the biopsy, what you went through?
So the biopsy sounds scarier than it feels. But when they describe it to you, it can be terrifying. But going through it, it's not that bad. Basically, you lie on your side, and to reach the prostate, they have to take a needle and again go through your rectum to reach it and take some samples, tissue samples of your prostate. And just the idea of a needle going up there again just sounds terrifying. But they numb you up, and you do feel a little pinching here and there as they clip the samples. But it really wasn't nearly as bad as I feared or had nervous. Again, when you read about the doctor describes it, there are issues of potential infection afterwards. So you have to be really mindful. And through this whole journey, do what the doctor says. That's really key. The doctor says do X, Y, and Z. It works when you do exactly what they say. If you do the typical, oftentimes male thing, if I can get by or I can get it out, just do what the doctor says. And so there's some, and I really honestly don't recall exactly what all the care was, but they give you some pretty heavy antibiotics and finish the biopsy to make sure there's no infection, and it's got to stay clean, kind of a thing.
Okay.
And so, but it didn't take that long. I'm going to say just a few minutes once they got started.
Right.
And again, you feel some pinching, but it's no worse than feeling someone actually pinching your skin and tugging. Maybe it's a pinprick kind of a thing.
Right.
But and when it's all done, then you got a lot more concrete answers to what you're looking for.
Yeah, you found out your Gleason score, and we'll get into that as well. So after the biopsy, it wasn't like you felt, did you have pain or any trouble sitting or anything like that?
There's a little pain, as I recall, for a day or so. But the fact that it doesn't stick in my head as being terrible means that it wasn't that bad. Again, someone stuck a needle in you, so it is sore down there for a little while.
Right.
But I was more afraid of infection than anything else. And so again, you do what the doctor says. I didn't have any problems with infection. And they mentioned that there could be bleeding. And I just don't remember offhand if there's bleeding, if I encountered much of that.
With the infection part, generally speaking, it's what did the doctor tell you to do to avoid it? It was, of course, take the antibiotics. I
Take the antibiotics, and as I recall, doing some cleaning down there every day. But I don't remember well enough to be precise.
Nope. Well, that's good news that it's
Yeah.
far back enough in the rearview mirror where are a little foggy. But I appreciate you sharing that. The Gleason score. So when did you get the results from the biopsy? And then if you could recall how the urologist explained what the Gleason score was and how you fared on the, say, scale.
Yeah, well, Gleason score is probably one of the most confusing aspects of the prostate cancer journey. And I was at work at the time, and the doctor was had the nurse give me a call, and I don't remember the reason the doctor couldn't do it himself, but normally he would do it himself, I guess. But the nurse called and explained that she was calling on behalf of the doctor. And it was a very busy day for me. And she said, "Is it all right if I give you your results over the phone?" And I'm thinking, well, yeah, sure. I got a million things going on. I'm writing down other stuff. Yeah, fire away. And so she said, "Well, here's your Gleason. We did find nodules that were positive for prostate cancer, and you had a Gleason score of it's like 3.3 plus 3 and 3 plus 7, or 3 plus 4." And she goes, "So they measure that as sort of like they add them together, so it's like a 6, 7." And I'm going, okay. And then, but that was kind of it. She said, "So okay, well we'll be back in touch." The doctor was schedule another appointment, and which we did. And then I sort of left it because she didn't sound alarmed, so I wasn't too alarmed. And then as I start, I get home and start doing some research, I didn't really understand what she told me. And then I realized, okay, that's, sounds moderately bad in terms of Gleason scores. And so it has to do with, yes, there's two numbers there. And it has to do with sort of the aggressiveness of the cancer and what they view in the microscope of how disorganized the cancer seems to be. And so the first number will be the most prevalent amount, and then the second number would be the lesser prevalent amount of aggressiveness and the disorganization of the cancer cells. Again, from my layman's understanding of it. Yeah, and then there's a left side and a right side, and so you generally get two numbers.
Numbers. Okay. Thank you. I know that's a lot, and it's a lot to get through, and we appreciate the layman's explanation. Just, your patient understanding. I think if you were to translate that, I mean, eventually you talk to the urologist to try and get a better translation of what this meant in terms
Right.
of prognosis and treatment, of course. That conversation, how long did it take to have that conversation with the urologist? And did he or she give you clarity about this at
Yeah,
that appointment?
that was when things got grim. It's, we went in and then, I had done some reading and realized that the 7 part was the part that kind of resonated with me. That's not a good number to have, because just for those its range is sort of 1 to 10 kind of a thing, and so your 6 sevens is moderately bad and aggressive, and then your 8, 9, 10s are really bad. And so, but we went in there, and it was very sobering, and if not downright scary. And so, they start showing you these charts, and he had this conversation that, we have to take action on this. This is not good. It's very aggressive. Looking at the PSA, because they're combining both the Gleason score and then the PSA, how fast it's rising. And he said, that your life depends on this. He shows charts with showed the survival rate. The survival rate is very grim and scary. And so that was kind of a very unsettling meeting, and it took probably about 45 minutes to an hour as we muddled our way through it. And most of the time, he's speaking, I think, to convince us that we need to take action, and fast action, and trying to explain somewhat the range of options available. And at that time, you're still trying to get your head around the first things he's saying is, that's just not a good number to have. But as frightening as it was, and you have to stand back and look at, okay, as we contemplate those curves, here's the survival curves, and they're normal bell curves, you see, which means most people are in the middle, and you get a few on the extremes on the lower end and the high end. And so our strategy was to look at this in terms of Lisa and I, my wife, of there's a reason some people are falling on one end or the other of that bell curve. It's a random sampling of the general population. And so we need to focus on what is it that we can do, that we have control over, that can put us on one part of that curve or another. And that was really where our mental attitude had to be, was what's within our power to change that we can do. And so coming out of that meeting, we were shell shocked. And I honestly don't know if the intent was to make sure that we did the treatment, that we didn't blow it off. Though one of the problems that they have with the recommendations for the PSA test is there's a concern of men going out and getting radical treatment, getting surgery right away after one test. And so that was apparently really rather prevalent, the men getting prostates removed that didn't really need to. And so I think part of the motivation behind those PSA recommendations were and they said as much in the studies, is to drive that downward. But we're on that opposite end here. The surgeon was, the urologist was, trying to make sure that we took action and didn't take it lightly. Right. And he succeeded in that, in convincing that. It was scary, very scary. And then moving from that, it's about trying to get information. And there's, if you try to cram for any test or learn anything, there's just so much information out there. But I did go to, get a second and third opinion and start seeking other advice based on the test. And one thing I will say for people that they do get a high Gleason score, an outcome where the doctor feels that it's very concerning, is you don't necessarily want to do all the research yourself. That's really a bad idea because, as we all know, the internet is full of exaggerations one way or the other. It's hard to find definitive scientifically based information. And so it's helpful to have a family member. In my case is my sister, who did a lot of our research for us, helped us out because she could look at it from more of a neutral eye, rather than trying to terrify ourselves with what we're reading and then trying to mentally discard it, which is hard to do. And so the one thing I wished I had done earlier was went to a prostate support group of some sort. Because I didn't do that until after all my treatment was well along the way. And I learned things there. I heard things being said that would have been very helpful to have known before going into surgery, making the decision on what kind of treatment. But the hardest part was trying to decide what treatment to go.
Actually, my last question for you, this is perfect, and you answered so many just now, but this is a great segue into, you wish you had, gone to the support group. There's a lot of information. It's like, people have learned already ahead of you. What were the top sort of tidbits or pieces of guidance or anything that you wish you had known prior to making your treatment decision that may be helpful for somebody else right now?
Yeah, I think the top part was, again, sort of knowing what to expect a little bit, just hearing other people talk about it. I have to say that I don't know if it's universal, but it seems to be for me that, I went to two different support groups. One was just a general cancer support group, and one was a prostate cancer support group. I went to the general one first, and there was a lot of emotion, which isn't bad, but a lot of people going through some rough times. And actually, the session I attended initially I was the only one with active cancer at the time. Most of them were people who had survived so far with the cancer, but were still terrified and worried about it. And a lot of talk about the emotional part of it, which it has its benefits. But when I went to the prostate support group, it's largely a bunch of old men who have time on their hands because most of them are retired. They know a lot about the X-ray machines that were irradiated with, the procedures, the topics. I sat there, and then of course they're bragging about whose was better, and so I realized, wow, I don't know enough sitting in this group because these guys know their stuff. And so it was no coddling, or very little coddling, it seemed at first. It was a lot more bravado, if you will. But that said, as it moves on, there is the kind hands there, but you realize that there is a lot to know, and learning about the options. Because one of the things that, just through my own research and my family research and going into this, is a lot of times the outcomes are kind of the same statistically, regards to treatment. So you're looking at sort of what those extra features of kind of like a car. All the cars you go out and buy a lot, they all drive, they all have the same basic core features. So what are the luxury items or the features you want to live with later? And that's kind of the same way with the prostate cancer. For example, in radiation treatment, it was far less invasive, a lot easier as an initial treatment. But there's still a chance that you get some residue PSA in there that you have to keep an eye on. But it's a lot less invasive necessarily, and some of the X-ray radiation treatments now are a lot more focused, so it's a lot less tissue damage around it. Where the surgery is more radical in the sense that you're taking the whole thing out. But I opted for that largely because I knew once it's out, it's not coming back if everything worked well. Now I was wrong in that at the end, but at least at that point, if there's PSA, I know it's due to the cancer, not due to anything else, because there's nothing there to produce it other than the cancer that was there.
Right. Actually, a follow-up there then, Bruce. When you were debating, and I know there's different routes, when you were trying to weigh the pros and the cons, you described the pros of the surgery. and the cons, I guess, people generally, what were you hearing in the support groups on why they decided to do radiation first? What's the impact physically after having surgery?
Yeah. Well, most of the radiation, a lot of the guys, I think they opted for that just because it was easier for routine. They didn't like the idea of someone cutting into them, or going in and removing something. On the other hand, a lot of the men, again, they have a problem with people removing prostates that's not needed to necessarily. So a lot of people, well, cancer, let's just get rid of it and I'm done. So you have both lines of thought. But most people that opted for radiation, I think, is largely for just the convenience of it, of doing it that way. That it didn't really impact their lifestyle in general very much.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. We're actually going to move on to the next section since we're ready to talk about the surgery. And so hang tight, and Bruce will describe that in the next video.